Okay, so moving now to the Norman Conquest as a topic, which Alex and Max Southern have studied relatively recently in their university lives, and they're going to talk about the teaching of this in schools. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, like how you said, we'll talk about teaching the Norman Conquest, potential issues and limited conceptions. So the first thing I want to put in there is we need to look at the wider 11th century. So in order to understand and teach the Norman Conquest, the wider context of the 11th century in Anglo-Saxon England need to be understood. We can't simply start at 1066 and then from there onwards from the Normans conquest from there. We look back further into Harold's reign, and even, I would argue, look even at late Edward the Confessor's reign as well. So by looking at Edward the Confessor's reign and Harold's reign, it will help pupils and teachers to understand why William held a claim to the throne. Also brings a further understanding to make more sense of second order concepts such as change and continuity, how we can look at how things change, such as land distribution, church, amongst other things as well. If we just look at the Norman thing and not look at what happened before, we can't really see what changed and what continued. So, a quick sum up of that slide. Teachers must look wide in the Battle of Hastings and follow events to fully understand and teach the conquest. The main thing we need to be aware of as well when we're researching and teaching the Norman Conquest is that a lot of the primary sources are written by the Normans or Norman sympathisers. There's an overall lack of Anglo-Saxon sources to study. There is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, but the historical value isn't particularly great. One reason for this is that a lot of them are not originals. They were reproduced many years later. So they've been edited over time and they're not exactly accurate as they were. For another example, much of Harold's reign regarding the land and land distribution is left out of the Domesday Book in 1086, I believe, or 87. So much of the Anglo-Saxons being left out by contemporaries, with only half a view of England in the 11th century. So this can lead to many assumptions being made, particularly in the change in continuity second order concept as well, making that part more difficult. A lot of the historians' perspectives as well have changed over the years. So when we are researching and again teaching the Norman Conquest, we need to be aware of this. Due to probably the primary sources, many of the historians up to the late 20th century actually took a dim outlook of Anglo-Saxon Britain. They saw the conquest as a weakness of the Anglo-Saxon state and saw the Anglo-Saxon England very backwards and underdeveloped. However, more recently, historians now argue the exact opposite, and argue that the Anglo-Saxon state was wealthy, powerful, and sophisticated, and it wasn't just simply overrun by a more modern and stronger Norman state. So we need to be aware of the change in historical perspective and be wary when we're doing background research, look when things were published and what primary sources, etc. they're using. And again, perhaps due to the primary sources being Norman leading, there is an overall assumption made by historians that Anglo-Saxons were underdeveloped. This leads to the conclusion that the Norman conquest came to England and modernised England overnight. We know this isn't true. This gives second order concepts such as change and continuity to appear very black and white, and it also reinforces that view that Anglo-Saxon state was very easily overrun by more sophisticated Normans. So we need to be aware of this and make it clear to pupils that Normans brought the change that Normans brought took a lot of time to happen, and not everything simply changed overnight. Many things continued, some things did change, and it took many years for that to change. Okay, I'm leading over to Alex now.
So I'm going to get you guys to do something just before I go into my section. So when I say the word Normans to you, think back to your secondary school education mostly when you're doing this, because I'm sure some of you are even better at this than me and even more of an expert than me. But what are sort of the first things you think of when I say Normans? And I've given kind of a list of sort of ideas that you can go for there, such as names, locations, buildings, and sort of the overall legacy of the Normans. So if you could like dump a few of them in the chat, that would be helpful. Hopefully a few of you don't come up with everything that I'm about to talk about and prove me wrong. But that would be helpful if you could do that. Yeah, I'm just reading them. I am reading them. I knew you'd do that, George. I knew you would. But yeah, so yeah, right. So the majority of things I'm seeing there are names like William, locations in England, battles that happened in England, and I think that is what has been left from our own educations, and that is what is mostly covered in our own like secondary school experience, and still is kind of now. Normandy, that's a good answer. Yeah. So Max, could you change the slide, please? So the one thing one of the things I want to talk about today is teaching the Normans in their wider context. This is something I wasn't fully familiar with until recently, until like trying to research the Normans for my own sequence and stuff like that. But I feel that we are in danger of causing a misconception amongst students that the Normans simply appear from nowhere and invade England, and that was their sole ambition and the sole legacy they left. When in fact, the Norman influence spanned multiple continents, and there's lots of fascinating stories from across the world that we could be using to engage students. So one notable example of that is southern Italy. So I know that George mentioned Sicily as well, so that's linked to that. So the Normans first started going over to southern Italy around the time of the conquest. So a lot of these things are happening parallel to what is happening in England. And that was sort of one of those was called Robert the Crafty. He's an example of that. And they sort of started to establish permanent settlements in southern Italy, whilst also fighting wars against the Byzantines in southern Italy as well. Furthermore, they managed to sort of dominate southern Italy in the end, and they'd taken the last Byzantine stronghold by 1071. They then moved on to Sicily. The Pope sort of used Normans as mercenaries to take back Sicily from its Muslim rulers at that time. It was eventually captured in the 1070s and united with southern Italy in 1130 to create a larger kingdom that was called Sicily, and this was ruled by the Normans. So that's one wider example of the wider world and the influence that the Normans had there. There's some really interesting stories as well about how Robert the Crafty staged a fake funeral with fake mourners in order to take a fortress. There's another one about, I think he's called Roger the First, and he ended up sending messages back to the Muslims in Palermo written in Muslim blood of the soldiers that they defeated. So there's some little sort of like stories in there that could, I feel like, excite students a little bit. Another thing to mention, I'm anxious of time, so I'm going to sort of brush over these. I've written some names in so that you can research these further if you wish to. But the Normans were heavily involved in the Crusade. A notable example of that is, I don't know how you say this, but Bohemond I of Antioch. And he was basically rewarded with Antioch after taking it from its previous rulers. And then there's Tancred, Prince of Galilee, and Norman Crusaders in general. So you can see that they were spreading into the Middle East also. And the last example I'll give is Northern Africa. So Roger II of Sicily, who was a Norman, began the conquest of Northern Africa, and this strengthened the connections between southern Italy and Africa, including things like trade. They also commissioned a book called the Book of Roger, which included information on the caste system in India, rice farming in China, and what they knew of Britain at that time. So it sort of shows that Norman ambition was much wider than Britain. Could you flip to the next slide? Right. So I've put some images in here of the Cathedral of Monreal, which is in Palermo, and it's an example of Norman architecture. You can see that maybe if you've seen the interior of Durham Cathedral, the top right sort of looks very similar to that with the Norman arches. But this is an example of some architecture that was a mixture of, I think it was built by Muslim architects and Byzantium architects and Norman architects. So they sort of worked together to build this. So it's an example of a mixing of cultures. Just thought that would be interesting to put in there. So yeah, I know what you're thinking. You're crying out for more information on this. You're thinking, why and how can we implement this into a curriculum? Because it does seem a bit much maybe and it might blow a young student's minds. But in my opinion, that, like I said earlier, it dispels the misconception that the Normans were restricted to England in their ambitions. It puts the conquest of England into a wider context. I mean, having taught the Normans myself, I'm sure a lot of you have done the same already. It kind of seems a very narrow view of who the Normans were and what they wanted, and their legacy overall. And it does kind of seem sometimes when you're teaching it like they appear from nowhere, and simply want Britain. But it allows students to sort of see that we as Britain are not the centre of the universe and all that matters, and that we were one colony of many at this time. It also, I feel, could be usefully used after the study of Britain, or sort of in the middle of a unit on the Norman conquest of Britain, because it provides some direct comparisons with the conquest over here, e.g. like cavalry charges in the tactics, similar ambitions of territory and land, the castles that were built to retain control, cathedrals like I've shown you. So there's a lot of direct comparisons that could be made across from Britain to the continent and further on. So it might allow students to identify what the Normans were, what was distinct about the Normans. And I also think it gives a really useful insight into how fluid and ever-changing cultures and societies are. It wasn't simply the English, the Normans came over and didn't mix at all. And it wasn't that in the continent either. It sort of shows that every country is a result of a mixture of cultures from others, and that things are forever changing. This could be brought in as a single lesson maybe, or potentially as an interruption to show what's happening in the wider world. But I feel like it's cut off a little bit at the bottom. But at a basic level, teachers should go into teaching this topic with an awareness of this wider context, so that students don't get the idea that we are all that matters. So yeah, flick to the next slide. Next. So one other example, I'm sure this could be done with other ethnic groups and other religions, but one that I would like to bring up that Chelsea and Becky will know about because I pushed to do it in our slot-in, was the role of Jews in the Norman conquest. So they were first, I'll give you a little bit of context first. So they first were recorded as settling in numbers in England in 1070. They were encouraged by William at the time because they were sort of used as moneylenders and financiers. This Jewish funding was crucial in financing the Normans' construction of both military and religious buildings. So some Jewish people profited hugely from Norman ambition. So as you can see, they're sort of integral to the conquest because they're funding a lot of the buildings that were being built, which were obviously hugely important in conquering England. They formed distinct settlements as well as mixing into local communities. There were Jewish communities that thrived in York, Norwich and Oxford. Those are just a few examples. They were protected by the crown, but as a result, they were taxed more highly than other groups because of that. And Henry I would later grant them refuge in royal castles if they were fleeing from persecution. And you can see the image at the side, that is Clifford's Tower being burned in that famous massacre that happened there later on. Yeah, so they also are quite a niche thing to study, but I don't think that they are detached enough from the conquest to be ignored, having known about them now. So I feel like excluding them is not giving the full picture of the conquest, but is also giving a representative view of it. They're integral to the story of the conquest through their financial contributions to Norman buildings. Their inclusion enables a greater understanding of how the Normans increased their power, because we talk about how the Normans built castles, they built cathedrals, they imposed their power on the country. But I feel like we, in the classroom, we largely ignore how they got all this money and why they were able to do this. And I think that this is like something that could be included quite easily in there, even as just a sentence, if you weren't going to focus on it much. It wouldn't be a simple bolt-on or afterthought, and I feel like it would appear quite natural if it was included, because they're so wound up with the conquest. An example of this would be Aaron of Lincoln, who was said to be the most wealthy man in England at one point. I think he was around during the later Norman rulers. but it was said that he was owed about £15,000, which is obviously probably comparable to millions now, on his death. And he was meant to be wealthier than the king. So it kind of shows that, and he had ties to a lot of like funding of abbeys and things like that. So they are integral, they are there. I feel like they should be shown more. Also, just a quick, you can see it on the slide, but I feel like this provides links to later examples of anti-Semitism that students will come across if you were to look at their persecution. So anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany, the Holocaust, and this comes into the GCSE thematic study of migration as well. And in the Magna Carta, apparently there were 2 Jewish clauses. They were clause 10 and 11. They were pretty important, and it was to make it, nobles were a bit annoyed that they were owing so much money to Jews at this time. So they wrote a few clauses into the Magna Carta to protect their relatives after they died from their debts. Yeah, so that's enough of that. So I'm not going to go massively into this because I realise we decided we were going to do this before we were given the reading for earlier in the week. So I can't really explain it better than Susanna Boyd did. I believe that's her name. I've got that wrong, I'm sorry. But the main idea to get across as well is that it's very easy we think, to promote the misconception amongst students that women weren't integral and weren't a driving force in the Norman conquest. I think Helen mentioned a few of these names earlier, but the main one would be Matilda of Flanders, who was William's first wife, but was also his regent. So she would rule over Normandy while he was carrying out conquests in England. He trusted her over his own sons, who were male, which I think is extremely significant in itself. And she provided stability in Normandy while the conquests were taking place. And there's a few other examples there of great women to use her term. But the main thing to realise is that at every level, women were integral to the conquest. Because, like you might have read in that article, Normans often married to English women to legitimise their claims to land. Women found increased power in both nunneries and abbeys. And the majority of slaves at this time were women. And a positive result of the conquest is that, often that I think is overlooked, is that the Normans practically banned and got rid of the slave trade at that time, which would have benefited a lot of women, even if they did become serfs. It was sort of improving their position. But yeah, I think that's all I have to say about that. But yeah, a lot of this has been said by earlier groups. But I think maybe another important thing to mention would be that the images that we show on PowerPoint should also be representative, because a child might have those images in their mind for the rest of their life. And if there isn't a woman present, it might be something that they don't realise they believe, but they do. So yeah, and we put some of the links that we used at the end. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. That was a superb survey. Thank you very, very much indeed. And I think that what you put on the slide back there, the two of you, about even if we can't fit all of this in, it's beholden on us to have more knowledge than the students do, so that we are in a position to select what we teach is going to be surely better than us teaching something because it's all we know. Because at that point we can do more with coherence. And what you're all today really drawing out and wrestling with is this idea of coherence, about it's the whole curriculum. So as Alex was referring to there, if you're going to be teaching about Jewish persecution later on, then to talk about Jews in Norman England makes a lot of sense. If you're in York and you're potentially going to be talking about the local issues in relation to Clifford's Tower, then to talk about Normans and Jewish people. If you're going to be talking about African and European connections, or you're going to be teaching the Crusades, then to talk about the Normans in the Mediterranean area, again, is starting to make those connections so that we've got coherence to our curriculum narrative. They're going to be delayed like everything this year, but there are going to be some Historical Association fellowship resources coming out of a teacher group that have worked on it over the summer and are trying to trial the resources now. In relation to this exact period, things like when you were talking about the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, things like deleting of parts of it relating to Edgar Atheling, for example, and how that changes our ideas. And you may have picked up on Twitter, but if not, look for it. Actually, Ian Dawson just tweeted it today as well. Stephen Baxter, who is one of the experts on the Doomsday book, who you've referenced him, What Caused the Norman Conquest, he's just published his paper based on his research work about the Doomsday Survey and what it reveals about England. And Ruth and I were actually incredibly privileged to spend a day with him just as he was finishing his research leave. And we developed from that some activities relating to the Doomsday book and also relating to Anglo-Saxon England. They're all on York Clio, so do mine and use them if they are helpful to you. And this idea as well of using the women to show interconnection, I think, is really important. And something I've realised belatedly is that sometimes if you look at who the women were, it explains some of the intricate relationships and what's going on in terms of the politics, and actually makes the teaching of the politics easier, because you start to understand how people are connected. And almost if you miss the women out, and I think this is true for an awful lot of the topics in the Middle Ages, you're actually making it more complicated when you're looking at the sort of high intricate royal politics. I haven't actually spoken directly much about Susanna Boyd's article this week, but I hope you really enjoyed it. So many of us read that when she produced it, went, yeah, that's what we've been trying to say, but she's just said it so much more coherently, and that's why it's become a real seminal article that we always ask students to read. Thank you so much, both of you. Has anybody got any questions they want to put on the recording?
Yeah, I have one. Do you think it would be more worthwhile to actually teach about the Jewish community and women in year 7? Because I know Alex said when we were discussing it, when we were doing our slotting, that a lot of what we teach in year 7 is actually just the same at GCSE if they are studying Norman Conquest. So whilst we do have the freedom in year 7, should we be taking the opportunity to teach about this?
That's a question for me, probably, is it? But do you two want to, Max and Alex first? Give your thoughts.
Yeah, I short answer. So yeah, I definitely think it should be covered in year 7 because, like you say, you've got more freedom at that time, so you're not as constrained by exam pressure and things like that. But I do think it was something that I'll admit that I didn't know about until recently. This sort of Jewish presence, I sort of came across it by accident almost. But there's quite a lot written about it, and I put some links in. But I think that the way that it links to other topics makes it valuable enough in itself, and that it should be mentioned in year 7. Because I know a lot of curriculums cover King John and the Magna Carta, and I didn't realise it would link into that until I started digging a bit. But the amount of links that you can make would probably expand if you carried on. But it seems niche at first, but I definitely think it should be covered at least a little bit. Or teachers should maybe have an awareness of the financial side of the Norman Conquest at least. But yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think what Helen was saying about knowing about the politics, especially through the women as well, is something that's particularly valuable. I know Harold, I think he got his position through his sister. Was it his wife? I get them all mixed up, but through his sister anyway, yeah. That's why the claim to the throne. So it is valuable to teach that, yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say as well, women are completely wound up in most of the things that are covered. So when you are doing the claimants to the throne, a lot of the reason why I really struggle with the exact family tree here, but one of the reasons why William does think he has a claim is because of one of his relatives who is a woman, and the complex nature of who's been married to who is something that is integral to both the claimants section and also later on when Normans are trying to legitimize their claim. But yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Sorry, go on, Max.
Oh, just agreeing, sorry.
Yeah, okay. And I think it's great to have brought up, and if I can just give you a little bit of the history of the classroom history a second. One is that I think we had a bit of an obsession with the Battle of Hastings, which perhaps we're moving away from, and therefore with the actual contenders, which again we're moving away from, too much focus on that. But secondly, it's only in the last iteration of GCSEs that the Norman Conquest has become quite frequently taught at GCSE. So you're absolutely right, Chelsea, to raise that. Suddenly it gives us that opportunity to say, well, if we are a school that's teaching Norman Conquest at GCSE, so we probably want a familiarity with the Norman world, then it can shift what we teach at year 7 in order for preparation. So I think some of what's going on in year 7 is probably a little bit because it survived since back then when we weren't, if you see what I mean, and now people are. I think it's ripe for change. So go in there and advocate for change would be absolutely great.
Fab, thank you.